Just to kind of tell you what my experience has been with the 6D Mark II is basically 2 days in Yellowstone. Mr. Stoner and I spent a couple days taking some bloggers and other gentlemen around and shooting with the camera, running it through its paces from early in the morning, late in the afternoon, a little bit of weather, nothing extreme. But it is, like they said, a Class 4 weatherproof camera. And the thing that struck me about it when I first picked it up was that the controls are just so familiar. And I have to say Canon does a phenomenal job when a new camera comes out. Most things migrate upward or downward, whichever way we're going. And the controls always seem familiar. So I could pick it up. There was a few new menus, but all in all, could pick it up and just go with it, which I like. I don't like to have to read the whole new manual and just relearn everything. So again, my background comes from being a nature, travel, and wildlife photographer. And I pretty much do not shoot with a 1DX Mark II simply because I'm trying to travel lighter than ever. I'm not getting any younger. So I'm doing the 5D Mark IVs, the 6D2, and the 7D2 Mark II. So those would be my primary cameras. I like them because of the size, the portability, and the performance of these cameras. So again, without too much further ado, let's jump in here. So it's all about the Canon 6D Mark II and my adventure in Yellowstone National Park with it. Before we get into all that, let's just talk briefly about the features. The 26.2 megapixel full frame sensor equates to 6240 by 4160 pixels if you're into counting pixels. And again, when I teach my classes, have my groups out, I tell everyone to frame the image the way you want it in the camera. You know, fill the viewfinder, fill the sensor with the image that's important to you, and don't crop a lot. Now, I'm not against cropping. A little cropping can always improve something. But I don't like to crop heavily because you don't have any information left or not enough information. If I have a client that sees a heavily cropped image of mine, they say, oh yeah, we want to buy that and make a 40 by 60 out of it, and it's only 3 megapixels left after I got done cropping, it's not going to blow up to the standard that I might like. However, with this high resolution full frame sensor, you can obviously do a fair amount of cropping and still have significant information left to print, publish, whatever you want to do with it. So the native resolution on it's 20.8 by 13.88 at 300 dpi. Now I've taken my 5D3, which is basically 20 megapixels, and made 40 by 60s that are stunning. Canon's had some at their trade shows, and they're ridiculously good. This is even higher resolution sensor than the 5D 2s and 3s ever were. And I will say that I don't know if it's my eye or my way of thinking about this, but it looks like the images are just sharper. I'm shooting with the same lenses that I've used before, but it just looks like the visual acuity of that new sensor is just top notch. I'm really impressed with just how sharp everything looks. Obviously, it's got a 45-point cross-type dual pixel CMOS AF. So what that's going to do for us is that we have highly accurate autofocus points beyond just right in the center of the camera. And the dual pixel is going to allow us to have autofocus during live view and video recording. So obviously great features to have. And I will say that the AF system on this camera is vastly improved over its predecessor. Not that I did that much shooting with the original 6D, to be perfectly honest. However, I know what the autofocus system was based on in that camera, and this one is light years ahead of what the old one was. So it is a huge improvement on the autofocus speed, accuracy, everything about it. I had no issues with it whatsoever in my few days in Yellowstone. So as we've already kind of talked about, our variable angle touchscreen, LCD, is going to be a boon to those of us that are just getting harder to get down on our knees and lay on our belly and crawl around and do these wildlife macro shots. It's going to make framing and composing a lot simpler. So again, I was not a fan of that, but it's kind of won me over. So I'll have to eat a little crow on that one, I guess. Another great improvement is the 6.5 frames a second for the capture rate. That's pretty astounding for that high resolution sensor moving that much data at 6.5 frames a second, that's getting into the realm of pretty darn good wildlife sequencing. So obviously there are cameras that go faster. The 1DX Mark II obviously goes 14 frames a second, which is considerably faster, but this is a higher resolution camera. I think it's going to be wonderful for wildlife. I did shoot a little bit in Yellowstone, but nothing that was moving very quickly. So I can't comment on whether it's going to be sufficient for birds in flight, that sort of thing. Again, it has Wi-Fi connection, Bluetooth, getting us into the modern age where we can connect with our internet and web-based buddies online, so we can easily get our pictures up with Flickr or wherever you want to put them, Facebook. So it's compact and lightweight. You've already heard me say that that's what I like in a camera that performs well in the other features in other areas, but the size and weight, and the size to me is the big thing, is I don't like to have to take an extra backpack. A lot of the restrictions on the airlines are getting tougher every day. So the smaller camera bodies, I don't even put battery packs on mine. I shoot them without it just to keep the camera size small. Not because so much of the weight, I can carry it, but I just don't want to haul it in and out on the airplanes. Okay, let's look at some photos. Enough about me yapping on that. This was a shot just done inside the lodge while we were preparing to go out early one morning. It's 400 ISO, 1 second, so it's pretty darn dark in there, right? On this particular shot, I exposed it pretty bright. I blew out the highlights a little bit, and in post-processing, found out that it held up really well, pulling those highlights back. And you can see up in the corner there, no visible noise. And again, this is a fairly long exposure in a really dark building. If you've not been there, it's not much light in there. So we took it out into the real world early in the morning and made some real world photos. And that's how I like to evaluate my camera. I don't go online and read every review out there. The bottom of the day, end of the line, is I got to take the camera out and I got to make photos that I can sell and distribute. And I can tell you for sure that this camera, I could make a living shooting with this camera. The images are that good, they're sharp enough, they're good enough for publication anywhere. So this is obviously pre-sunrise at the Upper Geyser Basin. Those of you familiar with Old Faithful will know that this is the Upper Geyser Basin where Old Faithful is located. So these are all shot slowish shutter speeds from a tripod, f11, f16, relatively low, 100 or 200 ISO. So again, we put it through the paces from extreme overcast to fairly bright, contrasty, backlit steam in the morning. So it held up quite well. Long exposure on the river flowing through there. First light on the clouds. We were always looking for wildlife. We weren't blessed with an abundance of wildlife on this particular trip, but we weren't there in the correct month for what I would consider the best wildlife shooting. So to be a good wildlife photographer, you need to be somewhat of a naturalist. The better you are at being a naturalist, the better your outdoor photography will be. Okay, just to show you, this is an original raw capture. I've done absolutely nothing to this image. And you can see that I exposed for the highlights up in the clouds. And honestly, this shot's probably a half a stop underexposed over what I would call what was the perfect exposure for this. But again, when I'm out shooting a landscape like this, I'm using the auto bracketing feature. I'm setting it up to shoot 5 shots, 1 f-stop apart. So I'm in aperture priority. I've got the aperture set. It stays set. And the camera's bracketing the shutter speed. And I just pick one of these and go with it, whichever one I think renders the most detail. But if this were to exceed the dynamic range of the camera by a great deal, I've got additional shots that I could HDR, use it, blend them together using the shadows from one and the highlights from the other if needed. But look how well this does opening up in post-processing. So that's a major improvement from where we started, and it's perfectly publishable anywhere. Quite impressed. And I always shoot horizontal and vertical when I can. You never know what the magazine editor is going to want, or the editor in general needs this or that. So I try to shoot it both ways if it'll work at all, compositionally. Again, here's my original raw capture. Yeah, no detail in the sky, right? Zero. It looks like nothing's visible. And in post-processing, it's there. So it's holding the highlights really well. I was quite impressed. And again, you got to remember this was a 2-day shooting experience here. So we didn't have the greatest light every morning, so we did the best we could. But Yellowstone never ceases to be an amazing place to go. I would invite you on our workshops there, our destination workshops, but they're both sold out for the middle of September. So those 2 workshops are sold out. Some dead petrified trees. The minerals have leached up through the ground, and we call these the ghost trees. A little bit of mist sliding in from the lower right. My primary lenses that I used with the 6D Mark II were the 24-70 2.8, the 100-400, which is what I shot the previous tree shot with, and a 16-35. That's my go everywhere bag. Full frame camera for wide angle shots, cathedrals, traveling, landscapes, what have you. And I also carry a 7D Mark II for wildlife. If I run into something, the 100-400 goes on. And then I've got the equivalent of a 160 to 640 millimeter lens, which is quite handy. Look at this example here. Again, kind of dreary, overcast light. I can't time when Old Faithful, or schedule when Old Faithful is going to go off, so I just have to be there. But look at the shadows. There's absolutely nothing in the shadows behind that. Post-processing, they look spectacular, and again, they've held up beautifully. Yeah, there's one of the prints, images that the print up here was made from. Looks like somebody actually printed it really close. Good job. But handling all of this contrast, late light, this is a sunset at Great Fountain Geyser with a wide-angle lens. And the other thing I like to teach when I'm out there, any class, is there's the overall scene. Everybody sees that, right? I mean, you walk up, there's this big feature, and there's great reflections. But then put your longer lenses on and start picking it apart, pulling out little pieces and details. So it's not always about grabbing just the big grand landscape. You know, the world probably doesn't need another shot of the Snake River overlook that Ansel Adams shot, 60 years ago or whatever. Sunrise on Lake Yellowstone before the suns come over the horizon. That's the tip of the day on most of the sunrises. The best light is well before the sun comes above the horizon. So get there a half an hour early. Spectacular morning. This is actually turning around, just looking behind us. We're standing on the road shooting the sunrise on one side. We just turn around, there's this beautiful reflecting pond on the other side, catching the morning light front lit. So always look behind you. Just one of the reflections in tight, the 100-400. It's rapidly becoming my favorite lens. It's just an amazing all-around outdoor wildlife lens. I thought we should convert one to black and white just for giggles, take the color out and see what we think. Yellowstone Falls right after sunrise. So you're seeing a theme here, right? Early in the morning and late in the afternoon when the light's low in the sky. We can get this raking light coming in on these ridges. And the good thing about this high-resolution sensor is these will make phenomenal prints. Again, I've printed off of the 10D, a 6-megapixel camera. Mark and I were talking about this before the session started. that I have a client that buys 24 by 36s for me off of a 6 megapixel camera, and they're phenomenal looking. They're sharp as they can be, and think what 26 megapixels is going to do. Just way better. And again, just zoomed in a little tighter, playing with the ridges. I love the shadows and the lines, using the telephoto lens to compress this a little bit. I love the two little trees down at the bottom, catching the morning light, kind of catching that accent light. Playing with some side-lit, backlit trees in the Yellowstone Canyon. I kind of went crazy on this, but I just love the lighting, how it's kind of spotlighting or rim lighting the trees. So one of the features I use a lot on the 6D Mark II is the rear button autofocus. Again, it was programmed very similar or exactly the same as my other cameras are. So I quickly programmed it to autofocus on the back button. So I push that button and it focuses on whatever I have the single spot on. Then I let go of the button and it won't refocus when I move the camera around. So now I can recompose to the best compositional point, and I don't have to worry about the focus moving. So I'm a big proponent of rear button focus. I even do my wildlife that way. You guys like that light? Just streaming through the valley there, lighting up the trees. Again, these are all telephoto shots, but they're shot at f/16, f/22, trying to pull it all into focus. So I'm using a relatively small aperture, so treating it like a landscape. So these are all stopped down pretty far. We actually drove the entire figure 8 loop of Yellowstone National Park one morning. We were out at 3:30 in the morning or something like that, and by 1 o'clock we'd made the entire loop. So the only road we didn't traverse was the road going between the skinny part of the figure 8. And there's not a whole lot there to photograph anyway. So we hit all the major points. This is at the northern end at Canary Spring and Mammoth Hot Springs area. Now think about what we have going on in this shot right here. We got brilliant, bright white limestone. Whoops. Wrong button. I killed the video or there we go. Bright white in brilliant sunlight and dark evergreen trees behind it, blue sky overhead. Look at the detail that's in everything. The whites are maintained, the trees look great, and the sky looks great. Now it took some post-processing to pull the trees out because the exposure, when I get it correct for the bright whites, everything else is pretty dark. But look how nice that looks. I think landscape photographers are going to be very happy with this camera. This is Canary Spring. This is actually shot at f/32, trying to pull that tree and the formation in focus behind it at a fairly telephoto setting, and it's not quite 100% sharp, and I don't normally recommend shooting at f/32, but I was trying to make it work in this case. Okay, so now we're down on the river here, and we've got our tripod, and we're doing some slow exposures. This, I think, is about 1/10 of a second, and yeah, I have that backwards. That is 1.5 seconds exposure, f/16. That is the 1/10 of a second. So flowing water, you don't need to make this a 4, 5, 6, 8 second long exposure to get motion. It's moving, And in a second and a half, to me, that's plenty of motion in there. It's your call, your vision. You can do it any way you like, but that's the way I do it. Then I zoomed in on the details, just the same approach as I did on a major landscape. Get in and just play with the structure of the water, the flow, the curves, the angles, the difference in the coloration in the water. Those subtle tones are all well maintained. So some of you may be wondering how it did on wildlife. Well, here we go. This is 2500 ISO, no noise reduction done to it by me whatsoever. And I'm telling you, when we were driving back at the end of the day, it's so dark you had to have your headlights on. You can see the guys in the background have their headlights on. Well, it looks like it's shot in the middle of the day here, but this was well after the sun was down. So it's dark when we shot this. So 2500 ISO. It did an amazingly good job. They marched right down the road till the ranger herded them over. Now this is at 800 ISO out in the bright sunlight, and this was literally a drive-by shooting. We had cars behind us, there's no place to pull off, steep embankment. So the elk is out in the field, and I literally rolled the window down as somebody was driving, and I just shot at 800 ISO, fairly fast shutter speed. And that elk was about half the frame, or half again looser than it is now. So I've cropped that heavily in my terms, and it still looks amazingly good off of a high ISO capture. Pretty impressed. Okay. Well, that ends the live feed portion of my program. All right, thank you.